One time he had a friend who was deeply conservative and like even refused to talk with, someone who was of the opposite mindset. Mm-hmm. And for me, like that's such a dangerous position, because like working in academia as a professor, many of my colleagues had differing ideas about God or politics or whatever. But what I usually found is that when I was able to convince them to come to the Holy Grail pub or whatever, after that second or third beer, there was a lot more commonality and camaraderie and uncertainty about both positions, right? So Brett, there's this question that keeps coming up in various spheres of influence in people's lives, whether we're talking about politics, religion, academia, or even in people's personal life. It's this idea that philosophy somehow, as it relates to theology, represents sort of an obstacle for people, that it's something that should be avoided. And I think it was the 2nd century Latin father Tertullian who said something along the lines of, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem anyway?" And as history, literature, archaeology has revealed to us quite a bit. And this notion, even in scripture, some people will quote the scripture from Paul saying that we need to avoid worldly philosophies because they sort of prevent us from experiencing this robust religious faith, as some of the more conservative interpreters will look at that. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that, man? How is philosophy related to theology, and is it something that Christians should avoid?
Definitely not something that Christians should avoid, because philosophy is the pursuit of truth. It's the pursuit of truth through logic, right? Yep. I mean, you're the philosopher. And I think that when people see it as an obstacle to theology, it's when their theology is inconsistent with what is true.
Right.
So yeah, it's definitely not something that should be avoided, as if theologians shouldn't be people of truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Am
I oversimplifying that?
No. I think it's, but it comes back to this basic idea of, as far as I understand it, trying to give some sort of definitive term to that word, mm-hmm. truth. And people will try like semantic tricks. We'll say like capital T truth. Like, in other words, this truth is bigger than the small t truth. And this is something that I approach in my philosophy classes immediately on the onset of the course, even before they begin reading any of Plato, Aristotle, or what have you, is this idea of how do we define truth? Like, if philosophy is this aim towards truth, what the hell are we aiming at? And so I break down certain theories of truth, certain definitions of truth, how truth finds itself situated in particular linguistic ideas. And it's funny because the word truth appears a lot in the New Testament. Jesus says something along the lines of, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." And that seems to be a very exclusive statement if you hold to a particular idea of truth that's grounded in truth is something that is absolute, certain, universal, and something that cannot be changed. But yet
that Greek term doesn't
relate to that at all, right? Yeah. The Latin term does, where we get the word veritas, like veracity. I want something verified.
Yeah.
But that's not the term.
And Tertullian is a Latin father, by the way.
Right. So his idea of truth would be like a truth period, right? Mm-hmm. And again, our knowledge, our limited amount of reason seems to show that truth, that whatever we want to call it, that veritas is really only limited to certain mathematical equations.
Where we define the parameters.
That's right. And again, it's very limited to the human scope of things. Mm-hmm. But when we talk about ideas that relate to our everyday life, like how should I live? what should my ethics be about, then we find this sort of interconnected web of subjectivity as it relates to truth, whether we're talking about cultural, geographical, socioeconomic positions, that truth becomes something that is highly individualized according to that person's position or place in the world. Like I ask my students all the time, how many of you guys lived in a country or come from a country not of the United States? And there's always 3 or 4. And I'll say, what do we do here that you find strange or peculiar? And they'll always say something, along the lines of maybe how we dress or, about what we value. But yet when I go to certain countries, I see things that are peculiar there that they find to be true, whether we're talking about cuisine, whether we're talking about fashion, religion. So in your estimation, how does religion sort of sync up with that same philosophical notion of trying to or attempting to find truth in the world?
I think it syncs up best in or through the medium of mythology, right? So here we go with definitions again. What is myth? People tend to think of it as something that's not historically true, and a lot of times that is true. But myth is an attempt to give expression to truth that we find difficult to give expression to.
Or give an example of like a type of myth that we hold. It doesn't have to be religious, but just some sort of historical.
Well, you can see, the hero's journey or the hero's motif, as
Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell kind of outlines, and others. You can see that in pretty much every Marvel comic and ancient religious myth, right? This desire to fix your aim on really an impossible ideal in order to set yourself up for ongoing progress.
Right.
So you have the hero, and the hero goes through these stages that can be identified in every myth, every Marvel comic, DC comic. They're all, it's consistent, right? So why is that? And it seems to be that we utilize myth to give expression to these inward, maybe even transcendent truths that we have a difficult time giving. What am I looking for? Concrete descriptions for,
right?
Which does play into what aletheia means in the Greek.
The truth, yeah.
That truth is this very complicated, interlinked web of subjectivity and
discovering,
discovering. Yes.
Yeah. So you put a in front of any word, it becomes a negation. So in Greek, letheia means to cover, to hide, to close. Aletheia means to uncover.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the beauty about mythology, especially as we're talking about like the hero's journey. You could look at Neo in the Matrix, Luke Skywalker, Jesus of Nazareth. It always begins with this sort of mundanity of existence, right? The ordinary world.
Yeah.
And then something disrupts that the ordinary everyday life, right? And then the hero is faced with a huge task that they are always reluctant to take, right? And again, immediately people who are listening to the podcast are going, oh, I see Moana. I hear Moana in that, or, this person or that person. It doesn't matter the hero of the story. They will go through those 12 steps. They may not be chronological the way Campbell lays it out, but it's important to the myth that for me, when I read mythology,
place yourself in there.
That's exactly right. The hero has to somehow relate to the everyday person, And you hear Christians talk about this all the time, right? When they talk about this idea of, substitutionary atonement theory, that Jesus had to die for our sins because that's the way God relates to humanity. We suffer, but so did God. But again, that's part of the hero's myth. Now, for many people, the idea of grounding their moral compass, right, their ethical sense of being and sensibility in myth is something that is quite offensive when you bring up, like, if I say something about the myth of Jesus or something along those lines, right?
Yeah.
It become, because they want to ground, it seems as though people want to ground their moral sensibility in something that's immovable, that it is concrete. Because otherwise, why don't we just do whatever the heck we want to do? Like, why not just take my license and freedoms and just wreak havoc on the planet? So how would you respond to that, to people who try to, who don't feel that religion is a type of mythos, but it's a mythos which gives us the truth about human behavior, human existence, that they want something that's concrete, absolute, universal?
There was what was her name? She was a theosophist. She was head of the Theosophical Society. I can't remember her name now, but she said something along the lines of, myth is truer than history. History is just the recalling of the bigger reality that's in play behind all of it. That whether or not Jesus actualized life, death, and resurrection, you can see in all the mythologies as well, right?
Yep.
That's in the hero's journey. Whether it's Tony Stark, flying a nuke up to the portal that in order to close it, and sacrificing himself for that, and he kind of dies, and he becomes a different person. He's resurrected into something new, or whether or not you believe that Jesus actualized all that mythology in history has no real bearing, though, on the desire for humans to progress that way, right? To die to what they were and rise to something better.
Yep.
Right? So, and the reality is that none of us can prove that Jesus actualized this mythology in history, that he literally raised from the dead. We can't prove that. Is there, I personally believe it, just as a disclaimer, I do.
Yeah.
But that's based, I can admit that that's based on historical evidence. I can't prove beyond any doubt that Abraham Lincoln ever existed.
Yeah.
I just have the history, right? So that's all we have to go on. So why do we fixate on that? And I think you're right to say that it's because people crave certainty. And if they can convince themselves that they're certain of, Jesus actualizing these things in history, then it somehow makes them feel better about their responsibility as a human being to progress, to become better, to die to what they were, and ascend to something greater. I don't know.
That's an interesting point, man.
But it doesn't change the fact, though, that we can't prove that stuff. So let's not fixate on that. What we can say for certain is that people need to die to what they were and rise to something better. But that
death is always, because we'll come back to death, that death of the self, whatever you want to call it, one's former self, and the resurrection of a new idea. It's always brought about by extreme challenge, right?
Yes.
By extreme challenge, change, etc.
Yeah. Even if you try to avoid it, it seems that reality's set up that way.
That's right. That's how you become new. There has to be some sort of tension, right? This challenge to myself, to my former beliefs, to my former sense of well-being, whatever. And there's a great German word for that. It's called Auseinandersetzung. It's this challenging, this bringing forth of a challenge that brings and emerges a new self in one's.
The Germans are awesome.
Oh yeah, dude. They have a word for everything. They got a word for everything. But even with like someone like Friedrich Nietzsche, who's famous for saying God is dead, right? Nietzsche loses his father at 5 years old to a brain tumor. He watches this man who was a Lutheran pastor who served God faithfully, and he watches his dad at a young age and still has this sense of questioning, right? To go, why would God let my dad, who served faithfully, die of this horrible disease, right? And Nietzsche coins this term, God is dead, and we have killed him. What are we to do with ourselves now, the murderers of murderers? Who is going to baptize us in the water? Who's going to clean the blood from our knives? And so on. He goes on that in the Madman Parable. But of course, Nietzsche didn't believe in God. But for God, Nietzsche's God that dies has nothing to do with this transcendental being or Jesus rising from the dead. It's this ideal of certainty as it was attributed to our moral sensibilities, that God was the grounding of the reason why humans were moral. Now,
the impossible standard, the ideal.
That's right.
Yeah.
Like, and of course, hell was always a fixture of that sort of premise too. But outside of that, we don't have to talk about that. But the idea was Nietzsche's writing in a time where science is on the rise. Science has, because of the Enlightenment, right? Science has broken away from any sort of religious dogma, any sort of religious determinism to say you need to say this about what we believe. Science is now operating in its own sense of freedom. And Nietzsche saw that as a ripple effect. Now humans need to operate in our own sense of freedom. There is no God for which or by which we can ground ethical certainties and ethical sensibilities to. But he feared that. Like his writings lay out a type of fear.
Prophecy.
Like
he pretty much prophesies.
What are we going to do?
The 20th century.
What are we going to do? And I feel like many people, whether they want to admit it or not, feel that same sense of fear.
Existential angst.
That idea of like, what if what I've always believed is false? That's a challenge that could resurrect someone into have a new sense of life and a new sense of meaning and significance. And Nietzsche at least was brave enough to open that. Now, again, the dude died of syphilis, right? And there are many authors who've punned the fact that maybe he awakened his own sense of madness by going down that route. But what would you say to someone who is on the sort of the precipice of questioning the same thing? What happens to me if I lose this faith in this God that I've had since my childhood? But I don't want to not believe in God. But man, there's so much about these doctrines and these creeds and these teachings and these practices and these expressions of Christianity that don't make sense anymore with where truth is heading, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, what would you say to someone who's facing that fear?
To keep challenging yourself with being a person that pursues what is true. No matter how uncomfortable that is. And, I think that where that often leads, if they need this comfort, is if you keep pursuing that, you probably won't end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It is scary, for sure, when you're faced with facts. So you mentioned science and the progress we've made in uncovering the mysteries of reality, basically. That's what science does, right? And so we know with mountains of evidence that the Earth is 4 to 4.5 billion years old, right? The solar system is 4 to 4.5 billion years old. And the way that we test that is solid, right? We have really seriously mountains of evidence to confirm that, okay? But then you have been raised with this belief that the Bible is somehow this inerrant dictation from God, and anything that has to do with dating the earth suggests that it's 6,000 to 10,000 years old.
Yeah.
But you're faced with all this science, these facts,
Yep.
all this evidence, solid evidence. What do you do with that? What's difficult for people to do is to look at that and let go of the belief
Yeah.
for the sake of what is true. What's difficult for them to do is to say, well, okay, maybe my interpretation of the scripture is wrong and I need to reinterpret this. Maybe the way that I see it as this inerrant thing, it needs to be rethought. That's a hard thing to do.
Yep.
But I would challenge them. You asked me what I would say to them is, do you want to be a person in pursuit of the truth?
Yep.
There are very few things that we can say about God, if God exists, that are incontrovertible, right? But one of them, it seems anyway, would have to be that God is truth, so all truth belongs to God.
Mm-hmm.
Either that or he's a giant asshole.
Yeah.
Right? He's this maniacal demon or something that created this, or like the Gnostic demiurge or something, Yeah. And if that's true, then being a person who pursues the truth should be kind of a foundational value, right?
Yeah,
for us.
I heard one of the more fundamentalist creationist guys, when faced with the fact of evolution, right? They still want to say it's the theory of evolution. No, it's the fact of evolution.
Yeah, right.
Even the fossil record lays out like creatures did not come into an immediate existence, right? That there is a progression of evolution. And I've heard a fundamentalist guy out at he's got like the big Noah's Ark thing out in Kentucky or somewhere.
Yeah, Ken Ham.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, he said something like, well, God put those fossils there to test our faith.
Yeah.
Like, what a jerk. Like, dude.
Yeah.
Even as a professor, I would never put like trick questions on a test.
Right. But now God has become the God of confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing, now you've got to reconcile that part of scripture that says that God is not a liar and that God does not, deceive.
That's right.
And what do you do with that then,
That's right.
So, yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, these creationists will look at the evidence, and even as they see the stacks of evidence, they just have to admit that, it's all there. And so they'll call it the appearance of age in order to test our faith.
Yeah.
Rather than just to admit that your interpretation of the scripture
maybe it just
needs to change, man.
That's right. That's right. And people I get it. It's that McLaren language, like that simplicity, which I like simple things, man. Like I'm not going to argue.
You're human. Yeah.
I like things to be simple.
Yeah.
I like everything just simple. Please. When I press my TV button, I want it to come on.
Yes.
You mean what happens even when our technology begins to get screwy? Something that's really not very simplistic, but it's made to be simple for us.
Yeah.
When something goes screwy, my Wi-Fi goes out, we immediately get pissed and we're like, and we try to cast the blame on someone, right? And so, of course, fundamentalists will cast the blame on those who are progressing towards this new ideal, this new interpretation, this new framing of Christianity, which is what I think our church attempts to do. But there's also this notion of in Nietzsche's idea that the church represented not only this moral grounding, but it was even a harsher word, this moral authority. It was the authority on all things pertaining to human existence. Now, I like what Bertrand Russell, the great English philosopher, said. He goes, how awful it must be for those who look to the authority for truth rather than the truth for the authority.
Well said.
And so Russell Russell was one of those proponents, like in this deeply skeptical sense. Like he lost his faith, just like Nietzsche, and it was a very painful progress for him. How has authoritarianism motivated the church to keep people in the realm of simplicity? Like outside of fear mongering with the existence of hell or eternal conscious torment or those ideals, what are some other ways outside of that, which again, we can't prove whether or not hell exists or what have you? Like what ways does authority, the authoritarian nature of the modern church, play into this obstruction of truth, do you think?
Gosh. So many ways. Because
it's easy for us to simplify to say it's just hell. Like you scare people with eternal conscious torment. Yeah. I think it's much more complex.
It is. Yeah. It plays into our evolutionary need to belong to a herd, right? So if you're in a position of authority, you got to keep the herd together. And one of the ways that the church has done that is through those authoritarian figures laying out what is acceptable in terms of belief, right?
Right.
And these beliefs are all attached to what I call our most vulnerable part of what it means to be human. You know, our spirituality, I think, is where we're most vulnerable, because our beliefs, our spiritual beliefs, deal with things like our existential angst. You know, we're weird. We are uniquely aware of our eventual demise, right? Mm-hmm. My dogs are clever. They're smart. They're entertaining. You know, endless entertainment, right? But I never catch Ollie sitting around, you know, dealing with his existential angst, you know, over his eventual demise.
His heightened sense of awareness of his impending death.
He just doesn't, you never see him doing that, you know, and you never see him setting up impossible standards so that he continues to progress as a dog, you know. But humans do that.
He's reading Camus and you're like, Ollie, what's happening?
What is going on?
Yeah.
You never see that. So
that's interesting.
But with us, we do, you know, and so it sets us up to, it can set us up to want to stick with what is certain, you know, and so we'll even construct, you know, as, in Brian McLaren's book, he tells the story of this guy named Sam who's a scientist. He's a astrophysicist, I think, or engineer. So he's responsible for, you know, making sure that satellites do what they're supposed to do and the timing of everything and all. He has to know all the physics and everything. But then, almost ironically, he's also steeped in this simplistic theology that he grew up with, you know, and he begins to struggle with it, not because of the intellectual problems with that belief system. He ends up struggling with it because he doesn't want to not belong to his Bible study group.
That's right, man.
Where his friends are. It's a strong draw, man.
Yeah, man.
You know, and so I think the church has done a lot of its obstructing of truth through that need to belong.
Yeah. Like a social constructivism, right? Like in order to belong, you have to believe this particular piece. And we see this a lot with like fringe cults, if you want to call them that, like Mormonism, right? Mm-hmm. To reject the various doctrines of Mormonism is not just to be ousted by the church. It's you're ostracized by your family, dude. Like your very family. I remember I was working at a church in Dallas, and it was more of a conservative church, and I was working there as part-time as an outreach and evangelism minister to help grow the church, to begin to ask questions. And the church was trying to progress towards a more inclusive ideal. But yet, you know, the authoritarians are not always the pastors, right? Sometimes they're the big givers who dictate a lot of that. Yeah. And I remember there was a lesbian couple who had come into the church and sat down and it was very apparent they were together, and and one of the ushers walked up and asked them to leave, and they didn't make a scene. They were just, because church was going on. And I watched this, man, and I became so angry, right? I was so angry, because here are people coming in to seek a type of religious experience, to feel a sense of belonging, and they are pushed out, right? So it's not even as though they were part of it and then kicked out because they no longer believe. They were trying to integrate into the life of the community, and basically was like, you're not welcome here at all because of these beliefs that, again, are absolutely ignorant, erroneous, whatever. And it was that moment I went and surrendered my resignation to the church. I said, this is not something I want to be a part of. And so however you think about me, there's no good reasons to stand on to oppress people like that, marginalize people. But outside of that, like we talked about, outside of like those more mythical ideas of eternal conscious torment, hell, there does seem to be this sort of precipice, right? Of one comes to this notion like, I want to be a truth seeker. I want to find the truth wherever it may lead. And it seems to be me that those brave souls that go over the precipice, right? It's sort of like that Indiana Jones, right? Where there doesn't seem to be any walkway.
Yeah.
And you throw your foot down and you lean on it and you realize, oh crap, this isn't all that bad, right?
Yes.
This isn't all.
Yeah.
And that challenge brings forth like new possibilities, new horizons of understanding what God is. I'm always reluctant to say God, he's awesome, or to say that. I always say, like, God is, right? God is not human. God is beyond any sort of appropriation we can project on to what God is. But yet it still gives us this, even our language is simplistic in trying to describe God, right? When we call God he, or even she, or we say God hears our prayers, God sees our struggle, God speaks to me. These all sort of assume God has human qualities. But when you realize like none of that is true, there's a freedom that one gets, right? There's a freedom, this amazing sense of freedom that you are responsible for yourself, right? God's not going to split the heavens to come down and rescue you from a sinking ship. It's not going to happen. We've seen over and over. He's not going to lift the plane as it's crashing to the ground, right? All of these miraculous sort of notions we have about God have been over and over again proven to be part of the mythos, right? Something, if God saves me, well, the mythos is he cares, or it cares, even if you die in the crash, right? It doesn't change the fact that God cares or whatever. But the notion here is what Nietzsche, to get back to Nietzsche, what Nietzsche was attempting to situate and reframe in this death of God was take responsibility for your life. Find something and run with it. Find something that you're passionate about, that sort of emphasizes and reinvigorates your sense of being in the world. Because God is dead. That moral foundation is gone. And guess what? We're not going to run around killing each other at rapid rates anyway, because that's immoral. And I don't need God to tell me that. We know, right? There's no scripture in any of the Gospels that say drive 20 miles an hour in the school zones, guys, right? We came up with that through our own reason, right? Because a bunch of jerks were driving fast through school zones, killing kids. And we collectively said, hey, maybe it's a good idea to slow the heck down. And then we improved upon it and say, maybe it's a good idea to not be on your cell phone. Like, none of these things have anything to do with a moral foundation in God, but it has everything to do with our rational capacities and functionalities, right?
Yes.
And when we stop and we see that a lot of the myth of God and Jesus is really to tell us something about ourselves. That's what I say about the Bible all the time. When I read the Bible, it is reflecting onto me. Where do I identify in these particular stories? Ricardo and I had a great conversation the other day, is sometimes I identify with Jesus, but it depends on which Jesus I'm reading, because the Jesus in Matthew is not the Jesus in Mark, and the Jesus in Mark is not the Jesus in Luke. Yeah. So I identify with different Jesuses too. So it's not like there's this congruent sense of Jesusness that I follow, right? And so for us taking responsibility, it is this divine conspiracy. I like the word that you use all the time, is wake up, find something. And for Nietzsche, it was music, right? He said, without music, life would not be worth living. And that's where he reinvigorated himself in what I would say, in reading his love of Wagner and then his despise of Wagner, was this sense of he connected with a religious experience through the music of Wagner. I remember being at a Coldplay concert, Brett, and Chris starts playing Ring of Fire by Johnny Cash. And dude, I lifted my hands and closed my eyes, dude, and tears start coming down. That was a religious experience in a very non-religious setting, because I could smell the marijuana coming from the patrons around me, right? But yet,
depends on who's defining religious experience.
That's right, man. But it was a very existential moment of connecting with something bigger and deeper and more significant than just myself. And for me, that's where our sense of responsibility is we stay connected. These the mythos of religion, for me, is not a good qualifier for absolute truth, right? Because the way I use the word truth is that aletheia. It's not truth, but it's a gerund. It's true thing.
True thing, yeah.
True thing.
That's good.
It's this idea that my responsibility, which is one of the values of the church, taking responsibility, is this ongoing truthing of my being. My being is truthing. So why don't I kill you, Brett? Because I'm mad at you because you said something that I disagree with. I don't do that because in my being truthing, I realize that's not a good option, right? That's not a good option. And so anyone who says, if I lose God or lose religion, then any idea is on the table for me to do whatever the heck I want to do with my life. Well, that's not truthing, and it's not being responsible in oneself.
And it doesn't even have support in the research that's been done on, the more secular a state is in the United States, the lower the crime. The more secular a country is, the lower the crime.
Right.
And that doesn't mean they're not spiritual, but it just means that they're not. It's not necessarily institutionalized or where they have these moral absolutes as their grounding for their own morality.
Yeah. So I view you as more of that theological side of our teaching core, and I represent more of that philosophical side. So I'm going to give a couple of recommendations to people to read some intro books to philosophy, if you will.
Real quick. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I just have a quick question before you launch into that next one. The morality, because you had stated that crime and all of those things are moving in a lower direction. Could the argument be made that the foundation of morality, let's just use a specific example, the foundation of morality, that life is sacred, was one of, it could be argued that transformation was made through the biblical text in the foundation through that journey. And then we kind of took that morality, that idea, and continued on with it. Could an argument be made that the foundation of morality was found through God, and we've kind of evolved past that in the sense of like, okay, this is our foundation, life is sacred, and then we kind of continued on with that.
So that God is like a stepping stone?
Correct.
Yeah, you can make that argument. I don't agree with that, but do we want to go into all the whys and why nots?
But I think it goes back to what you said, that if God is truth, then all truth belongs to God, whether that truth comes from some sort of scriptural reference in the Bible. Like, I think there's plenty of great stories, great commands that seem very reasonable and truthful. But the same instance, what about commandments from the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, right? The Quran, what have you? Like, those truths there, I don't think are owned by any particular religion.
No.
You know, even to say, like, America, I mean, you go, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., all of the monuments have Old Testament scriptures, right? The commands, right? The Ten Commandments are on courthouses and things like that. Without any sense of, like, irony, right? The idea, but there's no New Testament, right? Scriptures on any of the monuments. It all goes back to the Old Testament.
It's interesting.
So to say, like, America is founded on Judeo-Christian values is only partially true, right? I think it's only partially true. There are bits and pieces from that, from the Old Testament text that we've used, you know, to sort of ground our Constitution, if you will. But I think the more secular a country becomes, the more free it becomes, in the sense that, well, now, I don't know, man. There's something in giving people freedom and watching them do, you know, and again, they have to have an education in terms of, like, how do we understand responsibility? I'm walking with my son through this right now because he's struggling to go to school. And so I just gave him a real practical thing. I said, dude, wake up earlier, take a shower. You're going to feel fresh, rejuvenated. Do that, see what happens, right? I didn't command it. I didn't demand it. I said, see what happens.
Yeah.
And so his mom texted me this morning, did it again, got up, showered. Man, he was ready for school. It's 3 days in a row, but he took a shower each morning. Now, that freedom given him opens up the horizon of what is possible for his own sense of being responsible, right? For his own sense of truthing.
Yeah.
So the Bible could be a good source, Rick, in terms of, like, life is sacred. But I think, like 20 miles an hour in a school zone, we would have eventually come to that notion to begin with, right? And that's sort of my play on that, man.
Yeah, that's why I don't. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is, well, maybe we would have never come to that.
I'm not stating that that's what I believe. I was just posing the question as far as because you have guys like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, who are, if for those who don't know, those are famous atheist debaters that believe that humans would have eventually come to that conclusion, whether or not God or religion was created or existed.
Yeah, and that, so, you know, they're the view that, well, what came first was, you know, the chicken or the egg. Our evolution led us to evolve toward religious mythos, which helped us to evolve toward the idea of the sacredness of life, which helped us then again to progress toward what you could call, you know, humanism, secular humanism. Yeah, I mean, their argument is pretty solid. It's pretty solid.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think, you know, for those who might feel bothered by that, I don't think you really have to be bothered by that in terms of, does God exist or not? I don't think, you know, if God exists, I don't think he's bothered by it or it's bothered by any of that, you know. But what's important there is look at the evidence. And the evidence definitely suggests that, yeah, we would have arrived at this, whether we did it through the venue of religion or not.
Yeah.
There is something to the idea of a shared belief, like a shared understanding of morality or existence, to where we can all agree. And I think that may be one of the issues that we're having now, is that we've kind of lost our sense or foundation of a common thing that unifies us.
Yeah.
And you can even go back to things like World War II. The country rallied together. It was like something like 90% of the country supported the war effort once we got in. There was this unifying factor, whether it was under the guise of a lie or not. It was a unifying belief, and we are reaching for the greater good. I believe there has to be a foundation or a unified belief in the sense of the thing that binds us together, that kind of will always be there. And I think that's the thing that a belief in, with all its flaws, religion or belief in God, has catered for us for a long time. And I think now we're starting to see the repercussions of a loss of shared belief, and people are searching for things to believe in, to have that moral understanding or foundation.
Yeah, for sure. So what's going to happen?
Yeah, so for me, like that, the shared belief is, again, going to be part of that sort of inner subjectivity. Because you ask people now, like, to bring up the Nazis, right? People say, well, if I lived in Germany back in 1940, I wouldn't have been a Nazi. Yes, you would have.
Yes, you would have.
You would have. Sociological studies prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt. You would have been a Nazi. You would have identified with that shared nationalistic belief. Mm-hmm. Right? You would have come to see, because of the propaganda, that Jews are the problem, right? That they're the problem. They're the one causing all the disarray. They're taking all the money. They're doing all these things, whatever. And you would have come to disassociate with them, like to earnestly hate them. Now, you may not have known that there were concentration camps which were actually exterminating them, but you still would have had a disdain. We see that now, right? Mm-hmm. We see that now, that there is a shared belief because of this great political divide, on one side. It's almost as though we have to ground our feet in the far polar opposites.
Yeah, the polar opposites.
Because any overlap, any gray area, then I'm a weakling, right? I'm a weakling. I don't really stand for anything. So
right. And I have to deal, any gray area, I have to deal with uncertainty. And we just avoid that like the plague, right?
Yeah, and the same thing with religion. Religion may have given us a lot of great sort of ideas, right? Moral ideas to stand together on. But let's be honest, dude, it also gave us a bunch of crappy stuff to use. Like, for a long time, it was used to suppress people of color, right? It doesn't matter which religion. Southern Baptists have a huge history of racial discrimination. The Mormon Church didn't open up any sort of admittance into its leadership for black people until Marie and Donny Osmond were called out by Barbara Walters. And then the very next day, the prophet from Salt Lake City gets a revelation from God of this new movement we need. So we'll always have different things which interest us, right? In which we come together in community or camaraderie or shared values. And for me, I don't care what they are, as long as they're not meant to oppress or to marginalize or to harm anyone else's pursuit of truth and freedom and their own sense of responsibility. And so when you start having those conversations about, what is our shared belief, that's when it gets really hairy in terms of, what if I don't share this belief, but I do share this one?
Yeah.
Am I still in? And I think what I love about our church is that I think we do have a common belief.
Of course.
In the good, in the love of our community, in the service and sacrifice for the sake of others.
Yeah.
But when you start getting into the periphery of it, then those things become less important. Whether or not Jesus died for my sins, whether or not hell is in a place of eternal conscious torment, whether or not Jesus physically, spiritually, or somehow rose from the dead, right? Those things are on the periphery of what constitutes the values here, right? And it plays itself out that way. Outside of whatever happened in 2016 with the document here, I look at it like a shedding of skin, right? It's sort of a shedding of skin. And it was a challenge, but here you are on the other side of that. And I think great things are happening because the shared belief is not grounded in a very problematic text
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? In a
Yeah.
very unreliable historically, philosophically, or even pragmatic text of religious. Now, we do teach from the Bible, and that's what I say. When I say the Bible's the authority, I don't mean inerrancy or infallibility. I say
Right.
we teach from the Bible.
Which
here.
is demonstrably untrue.
right.
So anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
But the idea is, this is the authority. When I say the authority, is like this is the text we use to guide us. Now, we do pull in other texts, and I use a lot of authors and literature and even other religious sayings from other religious leaders when I teach. And I've yet to have anyone complain about that, at least to my face, to say, "You quoted Buddha? How dare you?"
I did. I had somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, they wrote an email because I quoted the Buddha on something.
Yeah. When I did it,
I also had an email that said, "Wow, I've never been to a church that quoted the Buddha. I like it."
There you
But
go.
I had another one that, they complained about
Yeah.
it.
But I think that's a great question, Rick. The idea of what is our common, like human life being valuable. It's a common shared belief, and those who don't share it are those who wish to harm. Like this is why we put people in jail when you kill someone. Like it's funny. Last night I watched Capote. So I watched Truman Capote's Philip Seymour Duncan or Hoffman played Truman Capote for his book In Cold Blood. And he said something in that movie that was really striking. He's talking to one of the murderers of the Cutler family. It was a family of 5 in like Nebraska that were brutally killed. And Capote went to write. He wrote the first true crime nonfiction novel, right? Which is sparked now. What's the most famous documentaries we watch? They're all about serial killers, right? They're true crime. Well, Capote started that. And he said something to one of the criminals in his jail cell. He goes, "I need you to tell me what happened." And he says, "And in doing so, I will not think differently of you." He goes, "Your actions are abominable." But he goes, "You have to know, I won't leave you. I'm not going to think you disgust me or anything like that." He goes, "Because if I don't tell what happened, you'll die with the world thinking you're just this horrible monster." He goes, "Let me tell your story." And it was amazing. And the guy opens up about what happened that night, but also opens up about his very troubled childhood and so forth. And Capote was able to capture that essence. And it was funny. My wife was asking me the whole time, "Why is he befriending this guy? Like, why? And I was like, because, yeah, what he did was awful. But there's this shared sense of humanity.
Yes.
Truman Capote kept framing this murderer he's killed 5 people with a shotgun, and 2 of them were teenagers. He had to keep reframing in his mind, this guy's human. This guy's human, all too human, all too human. We all have the capacity to do that within us at any given moment, and this guy did. And so that was like a really eye-opening thing, good conversation between me and my wife last night. I was like, he's not trying to justify the action, but he's trying to humanize the person, because this person is going to face the consequences for their actions, but the world has to see him for who he is, and he's not just a murderer.
Yeah.
Right? He's a very complex man who had a lot of psychological problems and all these things. But I digress a little bit there, man, to say, there are shared common beliefs between all humans. You read JFK's before he was executed. He goes, "Look, yeah, the Russians and I disagree on a lot of things, but here's what we agree on. We breathe the same air. We care about our children's future, right? We live on the same freaking planet that has very limited resources. Let's start from a place of common ground." And as we move out, the periphery things become almost unimportant, right? And I think that's the idea. I think that's what a new Christianity looks like, is starting from this common ground, and these peripheral things which we argue and debate about become almost irrelevant.
Yeah.
You know?
You said something before about the Ten Commandments, being posted outside of courthouses, and never anything from the New Testament. And so I thought, it's interesting because you see that new simplicity. At least that's how a lot of mystics describe mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
Like you reach a place of non-dual consciousness where you can still see the actions are wrong, but you still see the value of the human.
Yep.
Okay. You arrive at a new simplicity in mysticism where that things are brought back to that common ground.
Mm.
And that's where I'm hopeful our culture will eventually arrive.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, will we commit atrocities along the way? How many atrocities will be committed along the way in this desperate attempt to procure a sense of false certainty, because we see it slipping away.
Yeah.
How many atrocities will be committed, and during that process, that's the question. Yeah. But I think that it's inevitable, and that's why I call it a divine conspiracy. It just seems like reality is set up to move us forward, and that the freedom exists in the in-betweens, like how am I going to progress forward?
Yeah.
And so those are important choices that we're going to have to make, but we'll see how it all plays out.
I remember Ricardo said something one time. He had a friend who was deeply conservative and even refused to talk with, someone who was of the opposite mindset. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's such a dangerous position, because working in academia as a professor, many of my colleagues had differing ideas about God or politics or whatever. But what I usually found is that when I was able to convince them to come to the Holy Grail pub or whatever, after that second or third beer, there was a lot more commonality and camaraderie and uncertainty about both positions, right?
Yeah.
And so there's something, in veritas, vino in veritas, right? There's something truthful that comes out of those conversations, but you have to be willing, right?
Yeah.
To stand that ground,
That's the key.
Yeah. Man. Well, cool, man. Well, 2 books that you would recommend, theological books that would give an intro to some of these questions we've asked that are accessible to everyday people.
Yeah. 2 books. Gosh. Because biblical inerrancy is still such an issue for so many Christians, I would recommend Rob Bell's book, What is the Bible? For that reason. And then on the more philosophically heavy, kind of even apologetic, yet progressive views, I would recommend C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I would recommend Jesus for the Non-Religious by John Shelby Spong. Very accessible book about the historical Jesus and what historical significance he plays in the history of Judaism and the emergence of Christianity. It's a very accessible book. And I, too, would recommend a Rob Bell book, Love Wins, which brings into question this idea of eternal conscious torment, just from, again, a very rational perspective that grounds his theory. And
pretty decent collection of his history, Christian history, and how universalism has been something that's been there from the beginning.
Yeah.
Too. Yeah.
Awesome, man. It's good talking with you, man.
Always.